My name is Bill Sherlock. I'm the User Agency Coordinator for the Illinois State Police Forensic Science Center at Chicago. The duties of the User Agency Coordinator at this particular laboratory is to arrange, coordinate, and even do some of the training for the law enforcement agencies in the area that use the laboratory so that we can better serve them if they properly know how to use the laboratory, what we need as far as physical evidence, how much we need, how it must be packaged, so that we get it into the laboratory and do a much faster and more efficient job. Our main customer or agency for this laboratory is the Chicago Police Department, which is a department of about 13,000 police officers, and we run programs here constantly. Every time they promote a new group of detectives or a new group of evidence technicians, and even some of the advanced training for some of the other officers. I work very closely with the Detective Division Training Unit, which is a unit of detectives that are assigned to the Police Academy to provide training not only for the detectives but other units of the police department. We coordinate our training programs together, and has proven to be quite successful. This particular laboratory opened up in July of 1996, and since then we've probably run 3,000 detectives through here, either in new detective classes or advanced classes. Just finished a program where we ran 445 police officers through the new use of the gunshot residue kit. So we stay quite active in trying to keep our agencies current on new forensic techniques, things of that nature.
How do you get involved in burglary investigations involving safes and locks?
I started my police officer career, my law enforcement career, with the Chicago Police Department in 1967, shortly after getting out of the Air Force. I worked in the patrol division for a few years, and I saw an individual one day, one of the Chicago evidence technicians, dusting a car for fingerprints, and I became very fascinated with that. The next time the test came up for evidence technician, I took the test and I placed number 9 on the list, and they immediately called 20 of us to the unit. The evidence technician section of the Chicago Police Department at that time was the one-man units that processed commercial, residential burglaries, traffic accidents, administered the breathalyzer test, took all types of photo requests, photo lineups, child abuse cases, things of that nature. I did that for approximately 2 years, at which time I was asked to, if I was interested in the mobile crime laboratory. The mobile crime laboratory is the plainclothes unit of the crime lab. It's work in two-man car in plainclothes, and we investigated the major cases, the homicides, the death investigations where the cause of death was of a suspicious nature, the major burglaries, major robberies, and shootings of the police and shootings by the police. At that time, I even got more advanced training from Sergeant Art Pahokee, who was the chief tool mark examiner for the laboratory. As part of my training as an evidence technician, we went through kind of a basic course with Art, but in preparation for the mobile crime laboratory, it went through a more advanced course because we were going to be handling the, like I say, the major burglaries. and usually what we would be like a $20,000 above loss, or if it was what was deemed by the detectives to be a professional job. So we had a little bit more advanced training on it. Also with the surreptitious entry, what to look for in that type of a case, what we wanted, what he wanted submitted to the laboratory in cases like that. I worked the mobile crime laboratory until January of 1980, which at that time the director of the laboratory asked me if I was interested in becoming a tool mark examiner and studying under Sergeant Art Bohoke. And it was an opportunity of a lifetime at that point. I never thought that I would get the opportunity, although I knew Art for many years, that I would get the opportunity to actually be an understudy of his. Would be such a great honor. And naturally, I jumped at the chance. So I went to work, started my training program with him in January of 1980. Worked with Art until his retirement, which I think was April of 1987, and I continued as the chief tool mark examiner after that until my retirement in July of '96, when I came with the Illinois State Police.
How often do you work locks cases in the laboratory?
In my current capacity right now, I work very few cases because I'm not in the operational laboratory. I'm in the training and programs laboratory. I have done probably about 5 cases since I've been here with the state police. Other labs have deferred cases to me and asked if I would help them out based on my experience, and I'm gladly, anytime I can help out anybody and getting back involved in casework, I'd gladly do it. When you lecture to detectives at your academy about safe burglaries, what are the key issues? Understanding that many investigators will be watching this CD and this presentation for ideas as far as working their own cases. What are the critical issues that you cover at the academy with these individuals? Well, I think one of the things that a detective is concerned about is this particular case going to be part of a pattern? If they experience a burglary, a safe burglary where there's a substantial loss, whether it be through a cash loss or whether it's precious metals or some things of that nature, are we going to see this again? Is this a pattern that's forming? Is this a real safe job? When I teach, I talk about the fact that before it could identify it as a safe burglar or a pattern burglar, is to talk about the burglar that has, say, a safe burglary of opportunity. An individual or individuals burglarize a premise, and in the process of burglarizing the premise, they find a safe, whether it be a records chest or a money safe. And at that time, they're in there. Let's try and get into this thing. And they take the tools, the basic tools that they used during their entry into the property, which may be no more than maybe a claw hammer, a tire iron, a crowbar, or even a modified piece of metal that bent in such a way that they know they can get the leverage to compromise a physical security device, and they're going to try and attack a safe with this. This, to me, is not a person who is a safe burglar. Then the next group I talk about is the group where, okay, we're going to burglarize this place because so-and-so has told us that there's a safe on the property, having no idea what the make, the model of the safe is, whether it's a records chest or a money safe, anything of that nature, and they'll burglarize the property. They'll gain entry into the property, and they'll bring some maybe more substantial tools with them, but have no idea of how to attack this thing. Some of the telltale signs would be, they'll knock the dial, they'll knock the handle off, they'll attack the safe at the hinge side, they'll attack the safe in several different areas, and either may or may not get in depending on the type of safe. And also in the process, as the first group, they'll loot the office. They'll do things that a true safe burglar would not do. And then I identify to them the true safe burglar, the individual who's going to go in, and he's going after a substantial amount of, whether it be cash or precious metals or the valuables that may be contained in the safe. He's going to go in, he knows exactly what make and model the safe is in there, he knows exactly where the safe is placed on the property. It may even require compromising or circumventing an alarm, picking the locks, several different things. If it's worthwhile going after, did these people take extraordinary precautions to protect this particular unit? They're going to go in, maybe drill one, maybe two holes. They're going to leave the tools behind so that they can't be traced to them in any way. They're going to leave anything behind that might be tracked to them. If it was bundles of money and stuff like that, leaving the bank seals or the money wrappers behind, so that if they do get caught and they have a duffel bag full of cash on them, that there's nothing to link them back to that particular place. If they were drilling, hurry up and get rid of their shoes once they're outside, because they maybe even have a pair of coveralls that they leave behind so that they don't have any lubricant on their clothing from possibly the drill or stepping on some of the little pigtails that might catch in their clothing or catch in the bottom of their shoes. That's an identifiable tool mark which can link them back to a scene. They're not going to bother looting the office. If they see a nice radio there or something like that, they're not going to take that, because that can link them back to the scene. So this is the individual, this is the type of burglar that you really have to be concerned about, is that are they going to hit you again? Because when they hit you usually for some good bucks, and you have to be aware of this type of thing. So I try to stress the fact that just because a safe has been burglarized doesn't mean you're dealing with a safe burglar. You're dealing with some burglars who think that they're going to get into a safe, things like that. And another thing is the terminology. In my handout, I described the various types of safes, the difference between the two, so that they can properly identify in their reports, which is a very, very important thing, is proper terminology, so that when they write a report, they can write a good report that is not going to come back on them later when possibly there is an arrest or something like that, and they get into the prosecution part of it and be called to task about improper nomenclature and improper terminology and things like that.
Do you teach about drill points and the expertise required to properly drill a safe, and using that analysis to determine whether you're dealing with an expert, whether you're dealing with somebody that knows what they're doing?
Well, I show several samples of various drill safes, how they may even score a line to draw, to mark their spot. There's other situations where there'll be a drill, maybe one or two spots. Maybe they're going to drill and punch to try and drill and punch the bolts back, and they're really not sure, and they might have to drill a couple of holes and stuff like that. But I do have a couple of good examples of where they've actually measured and scored a line onto the safe, so that when they start drilling, they're going to be either right on the face of the bolt, or they're going to be right in at the one particular burglary we had. in McDonald's where they drilled into a safe and they drilled away the lever, the screw connecting the lever to the lockbox, and then went in. So I mean, that kind of shows you have to be pretty well right on, and also identified at one place they left all of their tools behind and showed some of the various tools that they used and had modified to fit their need. One example was that they had a standard bladed screwdriver that was ground down to look like a two-tined fork, which fit perfectly over the relocking device. If it needed to be and they needed to punch the spindle through, they could drill in through first and pin the relocking device in place, so that it wouldn't go off when they knocked the back of the lockbox off. And seeing some of these tools and seeing that, and I also have a nice photo slide that I use. It's kind of like an X-ray vision of a safe door, and I try to get the point across that this individual can figure exactly where everything is on the inside of the safe. He knows where all the relockers are. He knows where he needs to drill, what he needs to avoid, and things like that. So we get into a pretty in-depth case. Also, as part of the evidence technician training, as well as the detectives, I instruct them about the proper photographs that need to be taken so that someone else, if maybe they may not understand what's happening at a later time, someone else can look at the photographs and understand what's going on. Film, always express the point to them that film is very cheap and that proper photographs are a great thing. It's awful hard, and many times after I would be asked by the detectives, both Art and I, on several occasions, were asked by detectives to make crime scene visits, and usually some work had been done on the safe, and although it would have been nice to have been there before they replaced the lockbox and stuff like that, we can get a pretty good idea of maybe what took place. One of the other things that I talk about also in my presentation is that not to always look at a safe burglar as a safe burglar. I have a series that I show of safes that were made to look like they were burglarized, where in fact they were again staged. So to be unaware of stuff like that, just not every safe burglary is a safe burglary. For instance, I have one gentleman who was using a records chest to store a friend's $90,000 in cash, and there was 3 holes drilled in the safe. It was a records chest, a tall unit, and a popular name brand. And he drilled, or there was 3 holes drilled in the front of the door. So when the detectives got this particular case, they called, and I went out to the scene, and once I took some additional photographs, I took the inside skin off the door, found out that here we had 3 doors, which I had a real good idea before I took the inside of the door off that these 3 holes were nice, very nice holes that went right through insulation and not through anywhere near the locking device or anything else like that. So the detectives were very grateful at that point. Now they're not going to be charged with an investigation of a major safe burglary, as they were able to turn their investigation in another direction. And I think that's really some of the purpose of the crime lab, is that, and it was Art Pahokie's philosophy also, is that we're there to aid the investigators. They can't know everything about our job, so it's our job when they come to us with a question or things like that, that we can explain to them and help them in their investigation, give them some direction. Maybe someone puts a wrinkle in the road for them, like this 3 holes that went to nowhere. our job is to aid them in their investigation, give them some purpose and some direction, and say, hey, you might want to take a look at this, you might want to take a look at that. We're an aid to the investigator, as well as, besides being that, we're also, we sit on the middle of the fence. We're there to help the detectives in the case. We're there to help the defense in the case. We're there for the truth. And sometimes we don't make the detectives happy. Part of our job in the tool mark section was, say, footwear identification. A detective might have a burglary or maybe a violent crime, and he's got 3 witnesses that says this individual was running away from the crime scene, and that might be fine, but the footwear impressions on the inside of the crime scene don't match this individual's shoe, not even class characteristics. So they need to go look for somebody else. So I think Art's always philosophy was that we are there to help people, give them some aid in the investigation, and help in any way we can, no matter what their question might be. Give them some purpose, give them some direction, so that they can better do their job.
Professional tools, how often do you find them at a crime scene?
We find, and I'll have to revert back to my Chicago days. We would average probably around 1,300 to 1,500 cases a year in the tool mark identification section. We were responsible for the burglaries, the footwear impressions, tire impressions, fracture matches, the forensic application of locksmithing. So we did a lot of things. Plus we did serial number restoration on mainly firearms, but we also did it on some office equipment, things of that nature. And we have quite a collection of tools that have been modified, front-end cutters that had been modified for pulling out cylinders, different screwdrivers that had been modified, either ground down or bent, so that they know that when they're going after a certain type of entry, that this is the tool that they need. So I'd say, when I was in the business on a day-to-day basis, we saw a lot of tools that were maybe originally store-bought tools that were modified for the bad guy, and occasionally we would get the like I mentioned earlier about the safe burglar, who had a bunch of tools that were modified to fit their specific need. Screwdrivers that were heated up and had a little bend in the end, so that they could, once that screw was drilled out, that they could reach in, and it had markings on there and how far they'd stick it in, so that they could then hook the bolt and pull it back. The pin, the screwdriver that was made, so a pinning device for the relocking bar and things like that. So I'd say we see a pretty significant amount of those tools.
Were most of your cases where they were successful at burglarizing the safe, or unsuccessful, denoting that they were more amateur than professional?
The far greater number of amateur burglaries, where, again, there was that futile attempt because they found the safe on the scene or knew that there was a safe in there but had no idea of what to do, which was far greater than the actual, what I would call, professional burglar. We would get a series of burglaries. There was a series of burglaries with McDonald's. I think they ran 8 safe jobs before they were caught first. They averaged about $8,800 a weekend. They were all on Sunday night, going into Sunday night, Monday morning. Being the city of Chicago, being the size it is, approximately 27 miles long at the lakefront and about 15 miles wide, they would jump from one side of the city one weekend, go up to the next north side on the next weekend, maybe take a weekend off and start. So it was very hard with especially the number of McDonald's that we had in the area. And every McDonald's safe in this area, every McDonald's restaurant in this area had the same exact safe in it, so it made it very easy. They didn't have to do much more intelligence work after that. My contact with the McDonald's people is the McDonald's in the Midwest had 450, I think it was 457 of these particular safes. So pretty much any McDonald's in the Midwest area had this same type of safe in there. And the same is true with a lot of the chains. We also had some Boston Markets and some Blockbuster Videos that had the same unit in it, and they would go from weekend to weekend there for a while, and then the pattern would stop. Maybe they would move on to another city or something like that. But we would see those maybe 2 to 3 patterns a year, and then they would stop and maybe start up again the next year with something else.
What catches safe burglars in your experience? What's the critical evidence that the field investigators have to look for, both street officers and detectives? How do they get caught most often? Well,
I think it's been my experience in dealing very closely with the intelligence unit of the police department that handles this type of thing, is that going around and talking to people. There's a lot of people at nighttime who observe things. One particular case where a dog was barking, and the lady couldn't figure out why her dog was barking. Well, the dog was barking because there was some activity going on the roof of a McDonald's, and she didn't know exactly what was going on, but she called the police. And when the police responded, they found, kind of strange, a car parked in the McDonald's parking lot, and made a few checks around and found the guys were laying up on the roof and things like that. So I think the intelligence part, where they go around, they talk to people afterwards. Some people will see things and they won't call the police, and then later on, when they see maybe some police activity the next day, they'll wander out and ask what's going on. And, oh, well, I saw such and such. I saw a couple of guys, and they'll have remarkable descriptions of individuals, or even a car. One of the things in the city of Chicago, people are very protective of their parking spaces, and so all of a sudden there's a strange car parked in their spot, and they'll know exactly the make and the model, and they may even have noted may have even noted the license number, and then later this all gets associated together. We have made a few cases, major cases, on some footwear impressions that were left at a crime scene, some drill marks where an individual didn't take his leave the drill bit behind, where he had started a hole and then stopped and restarted and was able to cast the hole and then make tests later on with the bolt. So, but I think maybe most of your major safe burglaries, they know what our capabilities are, and they try and be very careful not to leave anything behind.
Are you catching the professional safe burglars?
I would say that, again, working closely with the intelligence division and the detectives, they may get us a few times, but I think for the most part we've been able to catch up to them eventually and stop the pattern.
The movie Score recently was released, and in it denoted a 150-year-old technique of blowing a safe by drilling a hole in the top, which isn't protected by glass and relockers, filling the safe with water, and then detonating a primer charge and blowing the doors. Have you seen this technique in Chicago? It was very vividly demonstrated in the movie.
I haven't had any I'm very familiar. We have in my slide tray, and it was something that was given to me by Art, who it was a friend of ours who sent us many years ago safe burglary where this was done on the East Coast. I want to say maybe Massachusetts, where a pretty substantial unit was blown apart using this method, and then they also, to see if it was feasible, used another unit as a demonstration, and I have pictures of that safe. It was a round lug door, and it was blown completely off. I guess the only saving grace in the one particular case is this individual used two primer caps or two detonators and blew the safe completely apart. And it was a coin store, and according to the information we received, there was a large pool of blood also, where basically it was kind of like setting off a landmine, and there was coins embedded in the walls and the ceiling, and there may have been a few rare coins embedded in this individual's ass. Never heard from again. I did receive a call a few years later. I believe it was probably around '89. It was a little bit after Art had retired, and it was from a small law enforcement agency in Wisconsin, and the individual was explaining to me about what had happened, and it sounded exactly like that. And I gave him the information, and I asked for a couple of photographs if possible and I never heard another word from the individual and stuff like that. And I guess that would be one of my major complaints, is the fact that a lot of times people don't want to share their information. They'll want information, but they don't want to share their information. And this is what hurts us. I mean, if Art ever thought that I was withholding information or not wanting to share information with anybody with me, I'd probably been taken over his knee. But that's the way we were taught. I was taught by him, and always thought that way anyway. That we need to share information for our common problem. The idea it's a great idea if as far as blowing a safe. Like I say, I've got slides of a unit, like I say, a pretty substantial unit that was blown completely apart, and so those are the only two instances that I'm aware of. But in theory, it works.
How did Art get into the business? Do you know?
Yeah, Art was in the Navy during World War II, and at that time, I believe he was just a seaman. I forget exactly what his duties were. Then after he got out of the Navy, he went to work for the Chicago Transit Authority, the CTA, the bus lines, and there he was worked in the shops, carpenter, things of that nature. Then he was called back into the Navy for Korea, and because he was an old-timer, he was offered a couple of different jobs, and one of it was to be the helper with the locksmith on the USS Oriskany, which was a small aircraft carrier. And that's where he pretty much learned the trade of locksmithing, and through the years that he stayed in the Navy, and then kind of stayed with it when he got out, not as a job, but just as kind of a hobby. After that, joined the Chicago Police Department, and pretty much went through the same steps I did. Was a beat police officer for a while, rode a motorcycle, and when they started the evidence technician section in 1960, In 1960, O.W. Wilson became the superintendent, and one of the first things he did was form the evidence technician section for the crime lab. And Art was in the first class of that particular new unit. Shortly after that, he was brought up into the mobile crime laboratory, and because of his expertise with being a craftsman, you might say it, a tradesman, was put into the tool mark section. In 1963, there was a case in Chicago where an actress, Katherine Grayson, was appearing in Chicago on a stage play, and her hotel room was burglarized. I believe she sustained like a $30,000 loss, but in 1963 monies was a lot. It was all fur coats and jewelry. And there was no signs of forced entry, and of course it was often referred to as a heater case. And the detectives really didn't know where to go with it. Lieutenant Havlin, who was the administrative lieutenant in charge of the crime laboratory, asked Art, knowing his background with locksmithing, if it was anything he could do by looking at the locks, because there was no signs of forced entry. And at that time he said that he'd look into it, and looked at the lock, saw these suspicious marks on the locks, but it's not really a forensic test. So what they did is the lieutenant rigged up a test where they bought 10 cylinders, and they got 10 brand new cylinders, and they got 10 used cylinders, and they had an individual attempt to pick the locks, and not all of them, just a certain amount of them. And then Art would examine them, and he was able to say, this lock was tampered with. An instrument, the terminology that we always used was that an instrument other than a key was used in the exhibit. And then, of course, some of the locks were not picked at all, weren't even attempted. And so that when he made his final report on this particular case, he had some basis for putting it down. After that, the cases just, I guess, started just seeming to roll in. There was questions not only from the Chicago Police Department, but word got out. There was all kinds of inquiries from agencies around the country. And when I first went in with Art, we would do probably 20 cases a year that came from out of state. Different agencies that would call and request, hey, could you guys possibly look at this lock for us? Most of it was through AFTE, which is the Association of Tool Mark Examiners, Firearms and Tool Mark Examiners, which is an international organization. Art was the president in its early years. It was founded in Chicago in 1969. And their charter meeting was at the Chicago Police Crime Laboratory.
Toughest case that sticks out in your mind as far as forensics and locks or safes? That was the most perplexing, or the real detective work and forensics that brought to bear all the tools and knowledge?
Well, I think one of the cases that really had kind of stumped for a while was a series of burglaries from the Aldi grocery stores. They were a crew supposedly out of New York City that just did Aldi's, and again they had the same type of safe in all of their stores. There was probably 5 or 6 in the city of Chicago, and they used, I believe, to be homemade wedges that were probably a series of 2 wedges welded together, so that when they beat them in, they didn't have to, someone have to hold them, so they didn't teeter back and forth. And I was never able to match, although I got excellent tool marks on all of the safes. They would use a series of anywhere from 4 to 5 wedges down the door. I was never able to match any of them, which is, to me, was kind of consistent with the fact that they were probably homemade wedges, and they either made other sets of wedges or they took those wedges back with them and maybe exposed them to a grinding wheel or something like that to change the individual markings. That was really kind of a challenge. The group was eventually caught, I believe, in Rockford, Illinois, but they were also a large group. Intelligence that we got from New York City was that they would send out 2 or 3 crews a weekend out to the Midwest where all these were popular. Another case which turned out to be a locksmithing case, and I was able to pretty much detail the steps, step by step, what the bad guy did. Attempted to pick one door. Because there was, well, let me just set up the story. Probably an apartment building that was probably built in the late 40s, early 50s, that had been converted to a condominium setting. Front and back door, inside front and back door. Went to the back door. Started, I believe, at the mortise lock, which had a pin tumbler system in it, which had been brutalized over the years, and the plug was filed fairly flat, and there was also the presence of a couple master pins, so that when the individual did get the plug turned, there was such a gap that the master pin wedged in between the shell and the plug, and the individual couldn't get the door open. There was also a rim cylinder on that particular door, and let me go back. On that particular case, the rim cylinder was successfully picked. The mortise lock is the one that had the file down plug, which stopped their effort at that time. The plug was wedged. There was real nice markings both on the shell and the plug from the master pin being wedged inside the walls. So then the individual went to the front door, which was just a matter of walking down the hall to the other door, and at that time was successfully picked the rim lock on that particular door and gained entry. Although this particular victim in this case insisted that she double locked the door using both the locks. Well, in supplying the detectives with a few questions to ask her, her definition of double locking the doors was that when she was on the inside, she used the thumb turn to lock the original mortise lock and also the rim lock, but when she left, she didn't even have a key for that bottom lock, and only used the rim lock. So it was kind of, and she sustained pretty heavy loss in jewelry, but it was more of an intrinsic value because it was stuff that was passed down to her mother, and the dollar amount really wasn't, I guess, the important thing. It did end up with some civil litigation where She was trying to gain some of her loss back because of the locks on the door, the condition. And when I really got into it, there was chambers that didn't have pins in them. There was just a lot of things that were wrong with it, and that's something that I would find a lot. But I think the important thing to the forensic people at this particular time is when I was called down to a deposition on this particular case, I brought down I brought a lock cylinder down. It had been sectioned open. I had fixed another lock up with a master pin in it so that they could understand what the two attorneys. And after probably a 3-hour deposition and explaining to the individuals, after everything was over, both of them, I asked them, I said, is this some help to you? And both of them admitted to the fact that they had no idea of what to ask or what had even gone on. Whatever happens when you stick a key in a door, had no idea. And by using these props to show them what had happened and explain to them, and I also had some Xerox copies of things and stuff like that to show them, and they had a much better appreciation of what goes on. So that I think was very important, is be able to explain to these individuals exactly what had happened. I found that a lot over the years, that being in Chicago, the apartment building complexes and the condominium complexes, especially the older buildings, where the janitor, the custodian, or whatever you want to call them, the super, is also the resident locksmith. And I would find plugs that were filed terribly flat, combination pins that were used as driver pins, probably because it made it work really nice and smooth, and things like that. And mix and matching of pins, chambers, many times chambers that were completely empty, or no springs, or things like that, that if the individual had any idea of how little security they really had, they wouldn't have been able to sleep at night. And I think this is really a shame that the proper people are not contacted when something needs to be done. When a new lock, a person buys a condominium, just because they hand you a handful of keys don't mean that all of the keys have been turned in, and it doesn't mean that this particular lock is, although it appears to be in good working order. You may have a 6-chambered system that's only got 4 pins in it, or it's got the combination pins are being used as drivers, and so over the years I had many cases with situations like this where and I wouldn't call a person a locksmith. A butcher had gotten at this thing and made it work, and gave the person a false sense of security, in that if a person came along with limited locksmithing ability or picking ability, would very easily been able to gain entry, because they may have thought they were good at it, but there was really no challenge. Probably a series of keys might have worked the lock, especially when you have the combination pins in there as drivers. It's really not a challenge.
Did you have investigate a lot of fraudulent claims where they make a lock look like it was picked, or make a safe look like it had been burgled in order to cover a claim?
Yeah, we had several safe burglaries where, after an investigation, looking at the pictures, we would be able to tell the detectives in the case, this ain't right. And also, same way, detectives would sometimes call us up and say, you know, I'm going to bring a lock in. The victim wants the locks checked for picking. Well, it's kind of like a good clue right off the bat that something's amiss, and we would find markings maybe on the first pin, or maybe first and second pin, where somebody had taken like a paper clip and just jammed it into the lock and tried to make it look like it had been marked. Absence of the tension wrench marks, and then just a probing type mark on the side walls of the pin, and maybe around the ogive of the pin a little bit, but nothing maybe beyond the second pin. And it's a kind of always a clue when the victim wants the lock looked at, stuff like that. So that's, like I say, that's probably, and over the years we did have several cases like that where we would be able to tell the detectives that there's insufficient amount of damage or marks on this particular cylinder to gain entry, and that it was more of an attempt to cover up or make it look like a burglary.
Did you see much use of the thermic lance in Chicago with safe burglaries?
I never saw anything, although I'm fairly well versed on the use of it, because a close association with Bob McGowan from Fink Safe and Lock Company here in Chicago, and Bob has put on several demonstrations anytime we asked him for a detectives class to bring out the burning bar. There was only one case that Art was exposed to before my joining him, and we have some slides of that. And also, there was a few cases where burning bar material was recovered but never used. Same way with cord. A lot of that stuff is stolen from construction sites and things like that, because of the steel mills around Chicago and the shipyards and stuff like that, which would be a popular tool around there. But never have I actually been to a crime scene where the burning bar thermal lance was used.
What's the most clever application of tools or technology that you recall to open a lock or a safe? Have you worked some cases that you were really intrigued with as far as the ability to manipulate the system?
Well, I think there's probably been a few cases. I think it's the ingenuity of people to do things, and this was not a major burglary ring, but the individual had come across with the idea of taking probably a 6-inch piece of pipe, had some rubber stoppers on the end and wrapped in tape, and because of the area that the individual was working in, a lot of the security was a rim lock, which backed up the lock and the knob on the door, and he would take a hammer and this little bar, and instead of trying to pull the lock out, he would drive the cylinder through the door. And like I say, it was not a wealthy community that was being burglarized. Like I say, but it was kind of ingenious that this individual had come up with these device to do this. Probably was pretty quiet with the amount of duct tape and rubber stopper that he had on there, but very, very effective tool, because you're working, there's no additional, especially no additional security holding the rim lock on, and this way you're actually working, pushing against or with the screws, and it was very successful. And took a little while to kind of figure out, because the evidence technicians were sending in the lock cylinders, and sometimes they wouldn't send the collar in, so that was kind of our clue when we saw the collars and stuff like that, because there really wasn't any markings on the face of the cylinder. But once we looked at the photographs and got some collars in, then we kind of figured out exactly what they were doing. It's amazing what people will come up with rather than